Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Cheeky Natives. I think today is going to be an exciting day.
Indeed.
Alma?
So does this house fall upon me? Okay. Hi everyone. Like the Tlhakanola has said, today is going to be a very, very interesting podcast. We have a very special guest on today's show. We have the amazing, the incomparable Black Girl Magic, Sisonke Msimang, here to talk about her memoir of exile and home, always another country. Hi Sisonke.
Hi.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. I don't know that I can live up to that introduction, but thank you very much. And thanks for having me on you guys' podcast.
No, thank you so much for making the time. I mean, I understand that you've been really busy traveling, Cape Town, Joburg, and how have the launches been so far?
The launches have been fabulous, and it's like sort of a dream come true to have people reading the book and engaging with it and disagreeing about different things and like thinking one part is better than the other or thinking this is my take on it when you never even thought of that yourself as the writer. So it's been great.
I think what's important is before we start, we'd like you to read from, your memoir, Always Another Country. So would you like to read for us?
Sure. At first, I wrote to make Mommy and Baba proud. So I also wrote, I guess, out of a certain sentimental yes we canness. I write now for slightly different reasons. I write because I am an African woman who is literate, and there is no diminishing what this means in a context in which so many others cannot. I write to escape my children and to find my peace with them. I write sometimes just to hear them say, "Are you still writing a book? How many pages is it, Mama?" I write because Africans and women and humans who have been considered less than others have always had stories and imaginations to take us out of the impossibility of the situations in which we have found ourselves stranded. I write because Simpiwe Dana sings and because Brenda Fassie is dead. In the face of the certainty of death, what else can I do? Where else can I go but the page when I am overcome by the knowledge that yesterday's songs were sung by women who died because they worked too much and lived in a world that was too hard and yet their melodies were so soft. What else can I do? Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay.
I'm sorry.
Oh my goodness.
I think for me, what struck me about this particular chapter, why I write, was, the idea that I feel that Black women need a space to exist, right? So one of the things you say is you write to take up space because in writing you take up space, right? And I wanted to know, early on in the book you speak about, when Baba had to help you with homework, you weren't so interested in him helping you with the math. You wanted him to read your good essays. And do you want to tell us, I know you speak a lot about it in your book, but the relationship that you had with your parents?
So I had a relationship with my parents which was one of respect and adoration, respect for both of them, adoring my dad. He was the freedom fighter. He was the fun one. We spent a lot of time, especially with my dad when we were kids, because he didn't have like a proper job. And so, he was studying, he would take us out like collecting bugs, and he had a very fluid kind of life. And so he was fun. And my mom was the one who made things happen, who, just as with so many African women, with so many Black women, just handling business. And that means you grow up as a child knowing you're loved and respecting your mom, but she's not that fun person. A lot of African moms don't have time for fun. And then as I got older, that really began to change. And in some ways, this book is a journey about becoming able to see your mom as her full self.
So you write in the chapter about mothers and daughters, about how you grew up and you finally began to see your mother as a human being, right? And to see her in the full spectrum of who she was outside of just being your mother. What do you hope, because you talk about S&E a lot, you talk about your children and we sort of feel like we know them but we don't. What do you hope they'll take from what have you taken from your relationship with your mom in writing these memoirs, because it was a chance for you to go back and to really rethink sort of the relationship that you guys had, and what do you hope that your children will take from their relationship with you?
I hope that I can do half the job that my mom did. If I can just do half of what she did in protecting us from growing up too quickly, in making us feel that there were rules and boundaries for life, and in helping us to become, because someone asked me this the other day in one of the events, and it was such an important question. I hadn't thought about it properly, and they were like, what is the biggest lesson that your mom taught you? And her lesson to us was to teach us to be independent. You know, the saving the money, like everything that they taught us was so that we would have more options, as many options as possible. So I hope that I can do that for my kids.
I think that's really important because, I mean, I recently lost my mom, and it was through preparing for her funeral, right, that I realized the lessons that she's taught me. Because I think sometimes we see these women as people who are supposed to take care of us, but we don't see the lessons that they taught us. And I can agree that, like, the one thing that I know my mom has taught me is to be independent. And sometimes it's a challenging independence, right? Because you are married, you have family, you have friends, people you're supposed to coexist with, but our parents teach us to stand on our own, and sometimes to our detriment, right? And I think for me, the chapter where you speak about your mom, in particular when you say, 5 months later she died, really stuck with me because, 2 weeks ago I got a call when I was overseas that my mom had passed away. And I'm reminded of your sister who was also abroad.
Far away.
Yeah. And just how intense that process is for you to travel all this way by yourself, to come and honor people who have raised us. And also just a reminder of how our mortality, like we can't live forever. So I really appreciated, and also the way that you speak about your mom, because I think sometimes we speak about our parents as people who are supposed to take care of us, and we don't realize that there are people who once had dreams,
Exactly.
who have actual lives, who want to achieve certain things.
Yeah.
So you've told us why you write, but why did you choose to write this memoir right now, particularly?
So I started writing this memoir a long time ago.
That makes sense.
And I wrote it as a memoir rather than something else, in part because I wanted to push myself and to test myself. And so I think what was expected by some people was that I would write a collection of essays, like my Daily Maverick pieces, all put into one kind of collection. And I think that would have been a good idea, and I still might do something like that. But as a first book, I really, the more I wrote, the more I wanted to push myself as a writer. So this book kind of departs from my public writing in the way that when you write about the news and current events, you have to sound like an authority. And in this book, I wanted to write as myself, and sort of bring down the levels to make it as accessible as possible. So I started writing 3 years ago.
Do you think that it made you more vulnerable? Like, Kakunol and I were talking about the book. I mean, so we all know you from, like, the Daily Maverick pieces, and the people who went to the Ruth First lecture all know you. But this has sort of been really, like, thrust your life into, I think, into public domain, because we're reading intimate details about your family and your children. Did you feel like the book made you a lot more vulnerable? I mean, you talk about, like, the trolls and the social media. Was there not a part of you that was a little bit fearful in being this honest in writing the book?
One of the things that I did while I was writing the book was I sought a lot of advice, because as we know, we don't do things alone. Like, no thing is just the product of one person. So I asked a lot of people advice about this whole thing about memoir writing and whatever, because it was very important to me. I think women should protect themselves where they can. So everything that I wrote in this book is a finished story for me. So what I often say when I teach storytelling to people is that a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so if you think about this book as a basket full of stories, each individual story is finished. And once it's finished, it means that there's a resolution. You understand what you've learned from it, and then you are able to move on. If a story is not finished for me, and all of us have stories that are not finished, then it's not in this book. So that's how I maintained my own sense of privacy, and also tried not to use the book as therapy. So although it deals with difficult subjects, they're subjects around which I've found some kind of peace, and that's why I can share it with people. If I haven't found peace with it, I'm not gonna put it on you, because the job is not for the reader to figure that out. The job is for the writer to explain the way she sees the world to the reader.
I think for me, one of the chapters that also struck me is, I've recently started doing my master's in the United States, and the chapter where you say Black girl in America really stuck with me, because I think it's still the same. I think that as Africans going to America, for me particularly, I found that blackness performs itself differently everywhere else in the world, and realizing the privilege. But you would have been in a different position when you went, because you had moved around a lot, so you weren't really in a country where the majority of people were black. So how was that, navigating that space as someone who felt that you were always leaving to another country and now having to stay in a place for 4 years?
I mean, America for me, it was and remains very important, because it's where I came of age politically in my own right. So being a kid and being told to go to young pioneers and being taught to sing struggle songs, you're just doing what you're told to do, and it's like fun, it's a game, it's not necessarily your individual self-selected politics. So America is the section in the book where I begin to choose my own politics rather than inherit politics from my parents. And I think we all go through that process. As a young person, you eventually make a break from what you've been told is important, and you decide what's important yourself. America is also the one country in the world that I find very similar to South Africa.
Yes.
The obvious difference being that in South Africa, especially now, we are a demographic majority, and that makes a huge difference for just our sense of how we feel confident and comfortable in our skins. So yeah, America is a very special place to me.
So he and I were talking about it earlier, and you sort of touch on it, the model minority, and I mean, just recently there was a story of the Cornell students, the African Americans on campus, who felt that they weren't enough African Americans being admitted, and there were a lot of Africans being taken in, and he and I were discussing the navigation that people have to do between being African and that the identity that comes with that, and sort of the African American identity, and how do you, and here now talking about that, because you touch on that in the book, how angry you felt with the African students who then fall back into those sort of lazy tropes about African Americans being lazy and this and that, and have your feelings changed in the time that you've left campus? Do you feel less angry with the African students? Because it's a fine balance, right? And how do we judge the ways in which people choose to navigate some really difficult systems?
On top of that is for me, having to understand the positionality as an African in the United States, the idea that we are less than, and you go there, one, because the education that you will receive is an education that is needed, but also the other thing is that you go there because people already think you are less than. So do you think that in your time, the positionality of the African students who were coming, I mean, also fair enough, there were some of the richest people who were going there, so they had some form of privilege, but also the idea that people thought they were inferior. Do you think that played into the model minority?
I think that you are always caught between at least two contradictory forces if you are a conscious person living in this world, and that what your job is to navigate those contradictions to the best of your ability in an as authentic a manner as possible. And so what you realize when you go to America as an African is that on the one hand, you are black. So America forces an African to reconcile with the notion of blackness and of Africanness. Okay, so on the one hand you are black and nobody cares about your Africanness if you don't open your mouth, and even if you do open your mouth, it's too late. They've already made a determination on you based on your on your skin color. And then you are African, which means you are not African American, which means you don't have the experiences that an African American had growing up. So you are not the same. So to pretend to be the same is dishonest and not sustainable and not useful to anybody. But to pretend that you are completely different and don't have the solidarity and don't have the understanding of what it means to move with that skin and body through the world, right? So you have to manage both. And I think what I was rejecting was this idea that many of my African brothers and sisters had, which was to reject the blackness and to only say that we are African. And that to me is never good enough. Choosing one is sometimes not really an option.
I imagine, for me at least, the most difficult chapter that I read, or like I was really frustrated, I was like, oh my gosh, was the Jason chapter. I was like, oh my
You're not alone.
Well, like, why?
No, everybody is saying this. So
Jason was frustrating, and I think we were frustrated because we all have our own Jasons, right? And it's like watching a train wreck happen, but you're driving, you are driving, and you're like, oh, I'm gonna hit something, but I'm still driving.
That's right.
And it's the reconciliation that you can be this really smart, conscious, like involved, determined woman, and then go on to make some really questionable choices in your love life, right?
That's right.
And it's navigating those kind of identities that I can love you, but also be cognizant of the fact that you're not good for me. And it was interesting in that chapter because it was also like the African parents, because I think African parents want your husband to appear magically.
Yes.
But want you to skip over the period where you date, you know? So
Yes.
you meet, you get your degree, because it's always get your degree, work hard, get your degree, then you get married. But there's no like in between. And the conversation between your father, for me, and you is like a watershed moment. It's his realization that you're an adult. And I think it must be the most terrifying thing for a father to watch his daughter have to navigate the kind of spaces that he can't protect her from.
And how did you, obviously you've already said like it's a closed chapter, are you still in contact with Jason?
No. And because there's some relationships around which you cannot, it is impossible to be okay with one another. That's just a function of the personalities involved, and therefore it would serve no purpose for who we now are as human beings. So no, we're not still in touch. But part of that chapter is is exactly what you said. It's like this idea that, you know, people are supposed to be magically appear in a perfect package, and then you say this is the guy. But also that Jason was an act of rebellion, that having been the good girl all along, like it was very important for me to just do something, even if it was reckless and bad for me, that sometimes you can't only live within the structures of doing the right thing. Sometimes you just have to fall. And I just let myself fall. Like I didn't do it on purpose, but I certainly just allowed myself to fall. And I think the very idea of falling for women is very important. Because if you think about like this idea of the fallen woman, the woman who is besmirched, who is dirtied, sullied by sex, by her relationship with men, by clearly things have happened, things have been done sexually that, right? There's no pretending anymore about that. And I think being able to be a fallen woman and to hold that and not feel shame is the most important lesson a woman can learn.
I think you spoke about it, you know, that things were done to a person. It reminds me of Praise God's Encounter. I think for me personally, it was a really hard story to read because I think it's a story of so many people. But I also am interested to find out, I mean, I guess you say you didn't speak because you wanted to stay alive, right? And how do you feel now, because now it's written down, right? Is it something that you told your parents later on in your life, or is it something that they were reading in the memoir right now?
I wanted to make sure they didn't read it in the memoir, but I hadn't told them until the memoir was imminent. I told other people, but not the older people in my life, the people who are very alive in this book. So it was very good because I needed to think about why I hadn't told them. So, you know, before when we were talking about like if a story is closed, that's when so the story was closed for me. But what you also realize is that your life is also a journey that involves other people. So suddenly I was like, oh, may have processed this issue. Like, I'm cool. But actually, like, they need to process it too, you know? And part of why I remained silent for so long with them is that, you also then at a certain point feel responsible for other people's feelings, that they would be like, so why didn't you tell us? We could have. And there's no doubt in me, and I tried to write it in this way, that there's no doubt in my mind that had I spoken up to them, so outside of that moment in which you are being violated, where, as we know with like, you know, Kwezi's story, this notion of freezing, of just survival instinct is so important. But outside of that moment, afterwards saying to a grown-up, like, this is what happened to me, that silence has nothing to do with my family and everything to do with rape culture. Like, that's what rape culture does. It transmits this unwritten message that says, you are the one to be ashamed of this, even though someone else did something bad to you.
And it's frightening because you were a child, you were 6, you were 5, 7, and you already knew, and that's how pervasive rape culture is, right? That even at 7, you know, when you're still a child and you haven't fully absorbed all of the patriarchy, and you are very conscious
you
of
get the
what
message
rape
of patriarchy very quickly. Yes.
Without it even having to be spoken. You can't even verbalize it yet. And I think at reading that chapter, and was also sort of in the wake of, you know, #MeToo. And it was just frightening for me that how many more praise gods exist, firstly. And how many, because you write so poignantly about having the resilience, you know, that sort of your social capital afforded you that somebody else might not have. And in the wake of, you know, #MeToo, that chapter was really, really difficult to read. That even when you feel that you've put in sort of the protection for your children, you know, you are always surrounded by adults, you are always, you know, there's no way to keep them safe. But it's also rape culture that we feel like we need to keep our children safe, as opposed to creating cultures in which our children don't have to be kept safe. Precisely. You know, that praise gods don't exist.
But I think it's interesting because I'm reminded of this scene of in the yearning Mohale Mashego addresses a similar topic, where Marubeni is taken into the yard of the caretaker.
Yes,
and everybody knows that the caretaker is a problem.
Everybody knows.
And I feel like in the same way, your parents and your aunties had told you not to go into his house, right? So there's a form of, and unawarely, there's a form of complicity that adults take when they know that someone is not correct, but they still allow their children to hang into the spaces.
That's interesting. I hadn't made that connection. I think that's really interesting. I mean, I took it as just like, and it's true. It's like, I took it as like, everybody knows that you can't trust men.
It absolves them of responsibility, right? Because it's, you can't trust men and it ends there, but why can't you trust them?
Exactly.
Why are we, and why do we have, the Tlhokomelo also writes, why do we have these people in our children's lives that, because everyone has that, do you know what I'm saying? There's that person in your community on that street, or that uncle, you know, and that is rape culture, like in effect, you know. And how did the people in your life react?
I mean, it was, we had some it was like a penny dropped for them. It explained questions that I think they had been afraid to ask, you know, themselves. And again, this one, like, I'm very comfortable about talking about praise God and the incident. I'm also very mindful of not telling other people's story, and so the story of like those conversations
is other people's stories.
Yeah,
no, that's really important.
Speaking of telling other people's story, you talk in your chapter about failure, which I was telling the Tlhokomelo earlier is very important for young black women to read, right? Because we get so caught up in black girl magic, black girl excellence, that there isn't room for you to fail. You don't have the gracious landing that somebody else would have in their failure. And you speak often about sort of giving people agency to, so when you talk about Nikki, for example, and that whole thing unfolds, you know,
the burnt incident,
the burn incident, and that almost everybody can relate to, you know, and we'll get back to that. How do you feel, because we always talk about this, that there are certain positions of privilege that you sort of have because of whatever you've accumulated or your social capital, that somebody else might not have, and that it's your responsibility to speak, but not speak for other people. And how do you navigate that?
Yes. That's probably the question. And that's probably, especially now with the book like being out, and having now just done all these launches and stuff, it's probably the thing around which I'm most ambivalent, because people are asking me to be a representative in a way that is like, I am very allergic to the whole idea of like being a leader, of being a spokesperson, even the idea of like existing as a public voice is something I find very hard to accept. So I was saying like now in the, at Love Books that like 2 weeks ago is when I got a website.
Sisonke.
Because people would always complain to me and be like, I was looking for your stuff and I couldn't remember which article it was, and then you don't have a website. So what's up with that? That's kind of weird. And I was like, I just feel really like if people want to find an article, they can just Google it, or I don't know, I just feel like, what does that mean? Who am I if I have a website? All this crazy stuff. So I need to realize that that's my own personal issue and just kind of own up to it. So I've always been ambivalent about that. But when you're in an institution, when you're an organizational leader, you actually technically are the representative. You actually technically are the spokesperson. So the position gives you a sort of credibility and authority. So I think when you're in a certain position of authority in which it's actually an institutional contractual relationship, it's a slightly different thing. But you also always have to be mindful that your mistakes will be judged, harder and better. But then I think this is why we always talk about this black excellence notion. So even though I think it's problematic, what it does mean is that if you are a black person who is doing well, almost by definition, you're better at your job than a white person, just because of the social situation in which we find ourselves. And it's a shame that that's not seen for what it is. But I think that is true, and it's great to be able to have the confidence of owning that. Sometimes other people don't have to recognize it for you to know it.
And we were actually talking about that, because this also calls into account sort of your living your politics as opposed to just speaking about them. And when we got to the chapter with Simon, Nitlakonolo and I, we were your mom, and we were just like, what is wrong with Sisonke? Like,
Let it go, leave the man alone.
Like, let it go, like. and later on here, and I was talking about it. I mean, so when your sister says, by virtue of your politics, you should just be dating a butch black lesbian, I was snapping my finger. I'm like, she's dragging me. I'm like, Zeng is actually dragging me, because by virtue of my politics, I should not be in a heterosexual relationship. I shouldn't, right? I should go home and have some conversations with Ben and be like, it's been great, but your politics are not aligned with mine. But the reality of life is such that it just doesn't work like that. That even how you imagine your lived politics to be, the reality of them sometimes is so there's like a chasm that exists.
That's right.
And I think also what's interesting for me is like, looking at the likes of Claudia Rankin, right, and Ginam Thobe, who are these fierce black women like slaying in their politics, and then you find that they're married to white people, and you're like, wait, hold up.
But you said.
But you are the one who said. So for me, I think it's also a touchy subject, because like I think a lot of people who have followed you have some form of, they're taken aback, and discomfort about this relationship.
Yeah.
But I want to know from you, in dealing with this, because I mean, I'm sure there must have, and there are continuously conversations and emotions and fights that you have with yourself about your lived politics and where you find yourself. How have you sort of navigated where you were when you were in America, Audre Lorde, and where you find yourself now?
So I think I've been writing for about 5 years. So by the time I come to writing, I'm already married to Simon, and my politics hasn't changed in the last 5 years in respect of my wokeness. And I find the label of wokeness interesting. Like, it's lovely that we have a new term for it. But in fact, part of what the book is saying is like, these ideas are as old as time. And here I am thinking like, my parents are not radical enough because I'm the first inventor of biconess, So by the time my voice is in the public arena, there's no conflict between my politics of of what I talk about in terms of race relations and what I practice, there's never been a conflict between them, because I've always written knowing who I am and about what I believe, and I've never ever written or said anything about interracial relationships not being okay.
Yeah.
So what people project onto what they think it means to be woke is a different thing that is not my baby from what I produce. So the thing that is my baby is the thing that I make. What I put into the world, I am responsible for. But I can't be responsible for what you think I am.
Yeah.
And what you think I'm doing, because I never have written in that way, and I've always complicated. Like, the essence of me is like this very nerdy, boring person who likes to complicate. Nothing is ever straightforward, which is why it's so hard to be in a relationship with me. Black man, white man, there's no relationship I've ever had that isn't complicated, where I'm a hard person to be in a relationship with, because I'm constantly questioning, negotiating, complicating things. And so, like, on some level, like, poor Simon. So that's why that thing with Zhang, you know, that always just like, babes, let it go. So that conversation with Zhang is a constant conversation between Zhang and me about everything.
I think it was also just, for me, it was striking, and I mean, we'll talk about that also, where we were I think people have an idea of what wokeness is, you know, and if you're fully woke, it speaks to you how you relate to white people, and like, you can't speak to white people can't be here, you know, and for me, the reality of life is such that even if we were to build our own planet somewhere, I think all of those social structures would still come in, and the real question is, so at the Ruth First lecture, you're talking about how initially Simon had to love you as a black woman, but now it's very different loving a black woman and then knowing that your children are going to be black because of how whiteness operates. And navigating that, I think, have you found that to be a little bit more difficult than just your relations with loving Simon?
Well, I mean, here's a great example of, and this is not necessarily blackness, but it's an example of what it means to be different people parenting children. So the other day, my son was telling us a story about something on YouTube that he saw, and he was saying, so there was this guy, and he stole, this guy came and he stole his cell phone, and then he stole his girlfriend, and then blah, 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 and he told the story. And I said, hang on now, what? To just say that again? He stole his girlfriend and he stole his cell phone. And he said, yes. And I said, what's the difference between a girl and a cell phone? And so he's like, a cell phone is a thing and a girl is a girl. And I said, exactly. A cell phone is a thing and a girl is a human. So nobody can ever steal your girlfriend, okay? Someone can steal your phone. Your girl has a decision. A girlfriend has a decision. She decides. He's only 6 years old. He doesn't actually know what I'm talking about. But it is very important for me to explain to him that there's a difference, that men don't own women, right? It's casual, but men don't own women. So I say this. And then he says, yes, mommy, you're right, okay, mama, you know? and then Simon says to me, I would never have thought of that. I would have let it go. You know, he was like, I wouldn't have caught it. I would have just let him continue the conversation.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't have let it go because I thought it's okay for him to do it. I just wouldn't have thought of it.
Of course.
And that's the difference between having a feminist mother and a non-feminist mother, a mother who's a woman and a father who's a man. Like, these are the things that it's the stuff of daily life. So I don't get angry at him for not knowing it, but I do hold him accountable for, I'm like, yeah, but that's like not okay. I'm not always going to be there, you know, pointing that question out.
I think it's interesting because Chimamanda, in her talk at Webley College, you know, speaks about these black women who are getting degrees, and she says, you know, it is not that men are inherently bad. It is privilege. Privilege blinds, and it's in the nature of privilege to blind.
That's right.
And I think that's where you're coming at, you know,
Yeah.
just the fact that because Simon has lived in a certain body, he exercises a certain form of privilege. There are just things that are going to walk past him.
That's
and even
right.
us, there are just certain things as cis people that are just going to walk past
That's
us.
right.
But I think what's important is to constantly hold each other accountable, because I feel like And that's the important thing, you
Yeah.
know. Living your politics means that when people say fucky things, you call them out on their
That's
fuckiness
right.
and just not let them go.
And then the choice, and I think that one of the things that is really important about this idea of calling people out on their fuckiness is that we have a spectrum of choices about what calling out looks like. My personality is that I don't like to call fuckiness out in ways that will cause a relationship to end, because that's just not me. And then I have great respect and love for people who call out fuckiness in the most like, boom, forget respectability politics. Like, so I feel like we also need to have a wide spectrum of what it means to hold accountable without judging that this form of accountability is the one way or the only way or the right way. I think there are multiple ways to engage in conversations about accountability. That for me, like, and that's where the trap of wokeness is.
Yeah, no, that's definitely.
Speaking of respectability politics, so when I was reading the book, I chuckled because I was like, this sounds like a lot of older black people that I know. So when you guys move back to KZN, and your parents are like, don't make a noise for the neighbors. I laughed because I was like, that legit sounds like a lot of older black people that I know, you know. And there's a huge disconnect because as young people, we don't get it. Like, so when someone is like, no, don't do that, I think we're a kind of generation that doesn't feel the need to perform for whiteness because you know how to assimilate. So if you wanted to, you could. You just don't really have a desire to. But how do you then sort of navigate that like respectability, you know? And I mean, you speak earlier about how learning that just because somebody's politics are different to yours doesn't mean that you need to be judgmental and harsh, you know? So I sort of feel that same way about respectability, because I can understand why older black people want to be respectable, but it also just drives me insane. I'm like, but why?
It's definitely a generational issue. And one of the things I find so fascinating about this moment in SA is that you have you guys' generation, so you have people in their 20s and like up to early 30s, but really in their 20s, who are completely products of not just born frees, but also products of refusal to engage in respectability politics as a politics itself. And then you have like my generation who were raised in respectability politics, but really are still close enough to you guys to understand the power of the rejection, but would not be operating in the spaces that we are because we've been working for 20 years. We have experience behind us. So when also people are like, oh my God, all of a sudden black women, you know, Pumla and Sisonke and what, and I'm like, that doesn't just happen.
Oh, nice.
That thing is 20 years of me thinking, you know, all these things. This is a product of like a lot of work.
It is.
There's so much to cover, right? So much to talk about, because honestly, my opinion and our opinion is that this is a really brilliant book, right? It's an actual page turner. I found myself just continuing reading and being like, yes, finally something honest and vulnerable. And I think it comes out when you said you've dealt with it. So by the time you released this book, you had let it go. So however people engage with it, that's what you do, because you had done it. But I think my question is, who are some of the writers that have inspired you? You know, I mean, you talk about Audre Lorde and you talk about some of the writers in the book, but you talk about Malcolm, you talk about Biko. But who are some of the writers in South Africa and in Africa who inspire you and who people are supposed to look out to?
Can I add an addendum to that? And who are women as well? Because I heard you. So in your book, you talk about how you felt the politics, you know, and you were Biko and you were feeling Malcolm X. But you later on went through, and it's such a realization for black women that some of these politics are not accommodating to you as a woman, you know. The whole notion that there will be the struggle for freedom first and then we'll start thinking about gender is not useful to black women, because I'm never ever not going to be a black woman. There will never be a space.
You can't put a parentheses around that.
There will never be a space that I walk into and I'm just black. I am always going to be a black woman. Yeah. And to ask me to reject that identity is to ask me to reject myself.
That's right.
So particularly black women.
Who are some of the black women?
So in college, I came across Pearl Cleage, and she was like the like we worshipped at Pearl Cleage's feet. I don't know if you guys have encountered her work, but I just love that book. It was first person, it was essays, she just was very important to us, as university students. I would say that I read a lot of fiction these days. And of course I love my contemporary, so I love Zuki Swa. I think she's like easy, fun, fast. And I say easy, like not in a bad way, like in a really like, wow, this is us, a wonderful reflection on some of the more difficult issues with such a humorous eye. So she's great. I read Mohale's book. I loved it. Again,
we love The Yearning.
The Yearning is beautiful. The Yearning is also so organically unapologetic. Like just dealing with our ancestry and not trying to, like using on the one hand like this form that you think is so modern, contemporary, and whatever, and then this story that emerges that is like so ancient and beautiful, and her fighting it. It's just gorgeous. I love that book. Who else? When people put you on the spot, I'm also very much an internationalist, so I love my Arunati Roy. Who else is out there at the moment? I really appreciate and love Pumla's approach to writing from the academy. The fact that she doesn't flinch or shy away from writing dense theoretical ideas. But she's the best kind of teacher. So she's saying to you as you read her, you are smart enough to sit up and reach for this idea, which is really lovely. And because I'm someone who really loves ideas but is not an academic, like there's not an academic bone in my body, I always have admired academics, like who, people who work. And then of course Claudia Rankine.
And I think it's really important to, this is why we started the Cheeky Natives, to have really conversations like these, because I think there wasn't a space when we started talking about books, there wasn't a space for people to hear the author, for people to hear what the author reads, what the author likes, because we want an archive. And we feel that there are white spaces that have these things, but where will you be 40 years from now when people are like, I want to know what she thought about her own book, So these are the spaces that we are trying to create, to archive blackness for black people and for by black people.
It's beautiful.
And I think this is...
Sorry, before you say that, Jamaica Kincaid.
Okay.
A Small Place is probably one of my favorite books ever.
So sort of just keeping, like he's saying, that we're sort of keeping a compendium of all the books that everybody speaks about. And it's always just interesting to hear, because you always hear titles that you may not have heard of, particularly if you don't interact with books academically. But so at the Cheeky Natives, we have a very interesting sort of rating system. I think like typical millennials. So how we rate books is we decide on how much land we're going to give you based on how much we enjoyed the book.
I love it!
Based on how much we enjoyed the book, so that when the revolution comes and the land comes,
we give you the land.
We know who we're giving, and also because black women will be, we've learned that black women will be at the forefront of this revolution.
Beautiful.
So obviously, like I said, the biggest say jokes. When it comes to apportioning this land, but we really enjoyed Always Another Country. I tend to shy away from reading nonfiction. I always tell the Tlhokomelo, I don't need to read about real life. My life is real enough as it is.
Love it.
But I really enjoyed reading this memoir just because I think there are some really important conversations that happen in the book that you have with yourself after reading, So you go and you reflect on the privilege that you have that you're not necessarily accounting for, I read the book and I was asking myself some very intense questions, like, so what am I doing with sort of all of the privilege that I have, that even, you talk about the resilience that you had as a victim that was because of your social capital, and I think that's the story for a lot of us. And we thought long and hard. We actually, when we were driving here, we were
I'm like on the edge of my seat.
We're
Do I
just
get
like,
like the Eastern
oh,
Cape? Are you gonna give me the whole Eastern Cape? Give me Western Cape. I could do something with that.
We love to give people the Western Cape.
Cape, but we're running out of space because we give everybody the Western Cape.
I think we gave Tandangolo Zana for his Man Who's Not a Man, Plumstead, but I think you deserve Lush.
Oh.
So what we were actually so in the book you talk about how you.
So the madam in me is happy as well. It's so good. I will come with title deed questions, receipts.
Bring the receipts. Yeah, we are happy you are accountable. We are happy. But once again, thank you so much, Sisonke, for writing such a powerful memoir. I think that it's very important to hear different kind of voices. And for a long time, we were talking about how the immigrant stories sort of been told from a very performative gaze for whiteness. And it's been beautiful to hear, because we're the generation that sort of missed being exiled children. So it's been really sort of an education to hear about sort of what I think we have an idea of what this freedom is, but we don't really think of how hard fought and how hard won that it was. And this was just a reminder of that. And a reminder that you can be a black girl slaying, but also be human and be vulnerable and make mistakes and grow in your corner without necessarily feeling as though your excellence has been diminished even by failure.
Yeah, and I think it's really important. Thank you for making the time
to come. That means a lot.
Speak to us about your book. I think that what's important for me is just, again, this honest account of what you've been through, for me, that's really important. Thank you for sharing yourself with us and for coming here. And also encourage you, obviously, to buy the book.
Do not photocopy. Do not ask the author for copies.
Don't DM the author and
Please
be like,
don't do that.
No, just buy the book.
This is why we don't have land, because you guys are busy doing this. Please buy the book.
All right, guys.
Thank
that's
you.
us.
That's the Cheeky Natives. Thank you once again. We'll catch everybody on the next episode.
Bye.